Imagine for a second holding the entire world right in the palm of your hands. Back in the 16th century, Spain wasn't just your average kingdom. They were the very first truly global superpower. Their flag was flying everywhere, from the Americas all the way across the globe to Asia. People actually used to whisper that the sun never set on their empire. But here's where we run into a massive, almost unbelievable historical paradox. Spain had just struck the absolute ultimate jackpot. They were sitting on a mountain of silver so massive it was literally known as the Treasury of the world. You'd think they were set forever, right? Yet, incredibly, against all odds, they managed to bankrupt themselves, not once, not twice, but 4 separate times in a single century. Today, we're going to explore exactly how on earth that happened, and more importantly, we'll look at why the financial blueprint of their total ruin is absolutely incredibly relevant to us today. All right, let's dive right into this.
So, let's just ask the obvious question. How exactly does the richest empire in human history manage to go bankrupt while literally sitting on a mountain of precious metals? Now, if you look at the history books, they always want to focus on the generals, the big dramatic battles, the shifting maps, but you know what they tend to completely ignore? The balance sheets. And the absolute truth of the matter is, Spain wasn't ruined because it ran out of money. It was actually ruined because it had way, way too much of it. They made one single absolutely fatal error that confused physical treasure for actual productive wealth. And that one fundamental mistake, it took their greatest possible strength and turned it into a poison that just completely rotted the empire from the inside out.
Welcome to Capital in Context, where we tell the stories behind the world's most important economic and financial moments. Each video explores a moment in time, a market collapse, a policy decision, or a financial innovation, to explain exactly what happened, why it happened, and how it still shapes your world today.
To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this, just take a look at this number: 180,000 tons. Back in 1545, there was this young herder up in the Andes. He lights a fire just to keep warm for the night, and by morning he wakes up and sees pure silver glowing right there in the ashes. Without even knowing it, he had just discovered Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. The scale of this find is almost hard to comprehend. Within just a few decades, this one single mountain was churning out 60% of the entire world's silver supply. Look at the timeline here. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain managed to import more silver than all of Europe had mined in the entire previous millennia combined. Think about that for a second. This staggering, unprecedented influx of metal practically built the world's first truly global economy. You had Spanish ships hauling bullion all the way to Manila just to buy Chinese silk, and you had Mexico City boasting fully functioning universities decades before the English even managed to survive at Jamestown. So on paper, Spain looked completely invincible. But underneath all that shiny surface, the brutal forced labor system driving it all, the MITA, was totally hollowing out their foundation. They were completely ignoring one of the most basic rules of economics. Money only holds its value when it is scarce enough to actually be trusted.
Which brings us to Section 1, the price revolution, and what we can call the very first wave of global inflation.
So as this massive, unending wave of silver just flooded into the Spanish port of Seville, you can probably guess what happened. Prices absolutely exploded. Imagine a little town where a basic loaf of bread costs 1 coin. Then, out of nowhere, 10 times more coins arrive in the town, but the number of bakers and the actual amount of wheat stays exactly the same. Those new coins don't suddenly buy you more bread, right? The coins just become worth a whole lot less. Way back in 1556, early thinkers and theologians, guys like Dr. Navarrus, really tried their best to warn the Spanish monarchs about this basic mathematical reality. He pointed out the obvious, writing, "Money is worth more where it is scarce and less where it is abundant." It's literally just basic supply and demand, but applied to the currency itself. So did the crown actually listen to this brilliant advice? Absolutely not. They completely ignored the warning and just kept right on spending. They were treating their newfound money as if its purchasing power was permanently static, completely failing to realize that their own massive spending spree was actively devaluing every single coin they minted.
This ridiculous influx of wealth triggered a very specific phenomenon that modern economists now call Dutch disease. Because Spain was just so incredibly flush with silver, Spanish wages rose first, and that made Spanish goods the absolute most expensive things to buy in all of Europe. Let's think about a local Spanish weaver during this time. Suddenly, that weaver couldn't even come close to competing with, say, a Dutch weaver. Why? Because the Spanish weaver's cost of living and production costs were driven astronomically high by all the silver floating around in his own pocket. So what happened? As a result, Spain basically just stopped making things. They stopped building ships, they stopped building factories. I mean, why do the hard work to produce domestic goods when your literal mountain of silver will just let you pay for cheap foreign imports? It makes sense in the short term, but long term, this completely, utterly hollowed out Spain's actual domestic production.
Now, if you were sitting there thinking, well, that's just a crazy 16th century problem, I want you to look at this direct modern parallel. We can easily compare 16th century Spain's massive silver dependency right alongside the 21st century US dollar's global reserve status. You see, because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, the rest of the world constantly needs dollars just to conduct international trade, and this dynamic artificially keeps the dollar incredibly strong. But what's the flip side of that? Well, it makes foreign imports incredibly cheap for Americans, while simultaneously making American manufacturing wildly uncompetitive on the global stage. Sound familiar? Just as Spain's flood of silver made its own domestic goods uncompetitive, we've seen the U.S. manufacturing sector plummet from 28% of the economy back in 1953 down to just 11% today. It is essentially the exact same mechanism, the modern iteration of the resource curse, playing out right in front of us.
And that leads us directly into our next major phase, the debt addiction. Or, as I like to call it, winning yourself into bankruptcy.
The crazy thing is, Spain wasn't just spending the silver they actually had sitting in their vaults. No, they were actively borrowing against the future treasure fleets that hadn't even arrived yet, all to fight these massive, endless wars. The Habsburg monarchs were pouring literal billions into fighting the Ottomans and the Dutch. They were totally falling victim to what we call the broken window fallacy, this deeply flawed belief that massive government spending on warfare somehow builds a strong economy. But what happens when a treasure fleet gets delayed by a storm, or worse, intercepted by pirates like Francis Drake? Well, the empire simply defaults on its loans. King Philip II had to declare bankruptcy 4 separate times during his reign alone. 4 times! The harsh truth is that war is simply not a wealth creator. Just notice the average GDP impact of war on this chart here. At the very onset of a conflict, real GDP typically falls by roughly 13% right out of the gate. And yeah, obviously the losers of those conflicts see a massive drop, averaging around 24%. But look closely at that third bar. Even the winners see a significant decline in their overall economic well-being. These big victory parades are, in many strict economic ways, a complete lie. They just give a population this temporary emotional high that perfectly masks a permanent, devastating fiscal hangover. When you spend your resources building things that are literally designed to explode, it carries a massive opportunity cost. It shrinks a country's actual assets and productivity for decades to come.
To really cement this idea, let's look at Great Britain right after World War II. It serves as an absolutely perfect historical parallel to our Spanish Empire. In 1945, Britain stood incredibly proud among the victors of the war. Winston Churchill was a global hero. But I want you to look at the true underlying financial cost of that victory. The war cost Great Britain £36 billion. If you adjust that, it's over $2 trillion today. Their debt-to-GDP ratio absolutely exploded to over 250%, the highest level in their entire history. Every single bomb dropped had been paid for with heavily borrowed money. And what was the domestic result for the everyday citizen? Well, as they entered the 1950s, Britain actually faced rationing that was stricter than it had been during the war itself. Basic things like bread, meat, and fuel were heavily limited. Sure, the British Empire had technically won the war, but financially, they were utterly drained and completely bankrupt.
Let's just quickly trace this rapid financial decline. By 1941, Britain was basically already broke. They were forced to take a massive financial lifeline from the US, a program called Lend-Lease. But listen, America's weapons and food didn't come for free. They came with massive strings attached. Washington wanted repayment, and more importantly, they wanted influence. Fast forward to 1944 at Bretton Woods. The British pound, which had been a dominant global reserve currency for centuries, was officially sidelined. The US dollar stepped up and became the brand new global anchor. And the absolute final nail in the coffin came in 1956. During the Suez Crisis, the US actually used direct financial pressure to force a British military withdrawal. For the very first time, London essentially had to take direct orders from Washington. It proves unequivocally that military victory simply cannot mask a fiscal hangover. Britain, very much like Spain centuries earlier, could just no longer afford the massive overhead of running an empire.
So you have to ask, have we actually learned our lesson here in the 21st century? Well, not quite. Modern warfare is incredibly technological, which means it is hyper-expensive, and it continues to lock nations into a permanent grinding debt loop. Just look at these numbers for a second. In the first 2 days alone of the conflict in Iran in 2026, it cost the US $5.6 billion. And that was just in advanced missiles. The opportunity cost of the Iraq War,
a staggering $860 billion. The U.S. war on terror as a whole, $1.68 trillion. Look, whenever public debt spikes dramatically during wartime, governments almost always finance it through massive money printing. And what does that do? It creates massive cost-push inflation. That inflation then crowds out private investment, it completely wipes out the hard-earned savings of middle-income citizens, and it acts as a direct transfer of wealth straight to the military-industrial complex.
But honestly, beyond the sheer astronomical cost of all that military hardware, the real, true tragedy, the permanent, unfixable economic drag on a nation's GDP is summarized right here: dead capital. We spend so much time focusing on the trillions of dollars spent, but we totally ignore the massive loss of human capital. Think about this. A single 22-year-old casualty represents roughly $1 to $2.5 million in lost lifetime earnings and production. Now multiply that terrible loss by the mass casualties you see in major conflicts, and you are looking at hundreds of billions in lost labor. These are young workers who are never going to innovate, they're never going to build local businesses, and they're never going to pay taxes into the system. This tragic destruction of the working population is a permanent structural drag on the economy that absolutely no victory parade can ever fix.
Which brings us to the final act of our Spanish parallel today, breaking the reserve, or the potassium fraud.
Let's walk through step by step exactly how you completely destroy a global reserve currency. Back then, the Spanish Peace of Eight was the world's first true global reserve currency. It was trusted literally everywhere, from the docks of Boston all the way to the markets of Beijing. But right around the early 1600s, the silver production at that famous Potosi mountain actually began to slow down. Meanwhile, the pressure from the crown to pay for all those endless, expensive wars was still absolutely immense. So, acting in total secret, the assayers at the mint started getting creative. They began to pocket the real silver for themselves and secretly replace it with cheap base metals. For years, these state-sponsored fraudulent fake coins just flooded the global market. Eventually, though, a former inquisitor managed to unravel the whole massive fraud. And by 1648, the jig was up. Merchants all across the globe just started flat-out rejecting the coin. The trust was entirely gone. And listen, in global finance, trust is quite literally the only collateral that actually matters. The moment the currency is revealed to be a lie, the entire system simply collapses.
Ultimately, this spectacular ruin of Spain reveals one absolutely crucial truth about economics. Real wealth is not just a finite mountain of extracted bullion. Bullion itself is not security. Spain made the fatal mistake of measuring its wealth purely in extraction, pulling physical silver straight from the mines and collecting tribute. But look at their rivals, the English and the Dutch. They measured wealth in systems. They were out there creating banks, establishing complex trade companies, and building highly productive domestic industries. You see the difference? One model is completely finite and totally subject to massive inflation. The other model is beautifully self-replicating. Real, lasting wealth is found in productive resilience. It's the ability to generate actual value that doesn't just depend on the random survival of a specific extracted currency or some paper promise from a bankrupt king.
So I want to leave you with this final, hopefully provocative thought. Can you spot the price revolution playing out in your own life today? Because if you make the mistake of thinking that just owning the mountain makes you rich, you are walking the exact same doomed path as the Habsburgs. The single richest empire in the world completely collapsed because it hollowed out its own domestic foundations just to pay for endless overseas conflicts, and it completely ignored the basic mathematics of money. People always say history may not repeat itself perfectly, but let me tell you, the math of debt absolutely never changes. It's entirely up to us to recognize these modern patterns of systemic rot and unchecked inflation long before that crucial trust finally breaks.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, hit subscribe to Capital in Context. Remember, it's not chaos, it's design. You were just never meant to see it.